The Middle English period, 1150 to 1500, was marked by momentous changes in the English language, changes more extensive and fundamental than those that have taken place at any time before or since. Some of them were the result of the Norman conquest and the conditions which followed in the wake of that event. Others were a continuation of tendencies that had begun to manifest themselves in Old English. At the beginning of the period, English is a language that must be learned like a foreign tongue. At the end, it is modern English. While the loss of inflections and the consequent simplification of English grammar were thus only indirectly due to the use of French in England, French influence is much more direct and observable upon the vocabulary. Where two languages exist side by side for a long time and the relations between the people speaking them are as intimate as they were in England, a considerable transference of words from one language to the other is inevitable. As is generally the case, the interchange was to some extent mutual. A good many English words found their way into the French spoken in England. We are naturally less interested in them here, because they concern rather the history of the Anglo-Norman language. It will be observed that the French words introduced into English as a result of the Norman conquest often present an appearance quite different from that which they have in modern French. This is due first of all to subsequent developments that have taken place in the two languages. Thus the of fest passed into Middle English as fest, whence it has become feast in modern English, while in French the disappeared before other consonants at the end of the 12th century and we have in modern French the from fate. The same difference appears in forest foray, hostel hotel, beastbet, and many other words. The influence of the Norman conquest is generally known as the Latin influence of the third period in recognition of the ultimate source of the new French words. But it is right to include also under this designation the large number of words borrowed directly from Latin in Middle English. These differed from the French borrowings in being less popular and in gaining admission generally through the written language. Written language. The event that began the transition from Old English to Middle English was the Norman conquest of 1066, when William the Conqueror, Duke of Normandy, and, later, William I of England, invaded the island of Britain from his home base in northern France, and settled in his new acquisition along with his nobles and court. William crushed the opposition with a brutal hand and deprived the Anglo-Saxon earls of their property, distributing it to Normans, and some English, who supported him. The conquering Normans were themselves descended from Vikings who had settled in northern France about 200 years before. The very word Norman comes originally from Norseman. However, they had completely abandoned their Old Norse language and wholeheartedly adopted French, to the extent that not a single Norse word survived in Normandy. Texts in Middle English, as opposed to French or Latin, begin as a trickle in the 13th century, with works such as the debate poem The Owl and the Nightingale, probably composed around 1200, and the long historical poem known as Layamon's Brut, from around the same period. Most of Middle English literature, at least up until the flurry of literary activity in the latter part of the 14th century, is of unknown authorship. Geoffrey Chaucer began writing his famous Canterbury Tales in the early 1380s, and crucially he chose to write it in English. Other important works were written in English around the same time, if not earlier, including William Langland's Piers Plowman and the anonymous Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. But the Canterbury Tales is usually considered the first great works of English literature, and the first demonstration of the artistic legitimacy of vernacular Middle English, as opposed to French or Latin. The language differed almost from country to country, and noticeable variations are sometimes observable between different parts of the same country. The features characteristic of a given dialect do not all over the same territory, some extend into adjoining districts of may be characteristic also of another dialect. Consequently, it is rather difficult to decide how many dialectal divisions should be recognized and to mark off with any exactness their respective boundaries. In a rough way, however, it is customary to distinguish four principal dialects of Middle English: Northern, East Midland, West Midland and Southern.